uncles hired a nearby neighbor to take care of and clean my grandmother's house every once in a while. Unfortunately, though, her health continues to decline. She told my father that she wants to stay in her old home. At first, we didn't really like the or something else. But then it looked at me, and all I remember were its huge red eyes and a huge wide grin filled with teeth. It was at this point, too, that I tried to scream my lungs out, but my voice stuck at my throat and my body felt stiff like I was paralyzed. All I could do in the end was slowly pull up the blanket and hide my body underneath it and try and force myself back to sleep, hoping that the whole thing was just a nightmare or something. The next day, I simply sat alone at the stairs trying to get rid of the memories of what happened and process the whole event. But from the corner of my eye, I could sense that someone or something had been peeking around from the toilet area looking at the living room. It looks as if it was a child, or simply the size of a child anyway, with sort of pale gray skin. Again, too, at first I just thought it was my imagination. But it happened throughout the day and the nights, and then I heard my aunts talking with each other, and it turns out that I wasn't the only one who noticed it, because apparently the entire family had seen it. Or rather, we could only see it out of the corner of our eyes. But when we all tried to turn to look at it directly, it just simply disappeared. Some people as well decided to check it out themselves, and yet there was always nothing there. My uncle quietly told us one day, though, that when a house was abandoned for too long, there's always something that tends to move in. The house was abandoned for about 2 years before this, so obviously something had come in, and now it felt that was right in front of it. But every time I entered that house, I could still sense this small figure poking out its head from the toilet wall, or the shadows that would move around the house, just all over the place. My grandmother passed away around 8 years ago, and since then, we have just never had a reason to stay at that house ever again. The house was downsized as well while I was at university, but it still has the and became strangely eager to get hugs too when I was greeting my friends. When I would hug my friends goodbye and not him, he would even ask to get hugged. For instance, when I would hug my friends goodbye and not him, he would even ask to get hugged also. Trying to smuggle dope into the country using a drug mule who had swallowed the drugs but couldn't pass them. The man had tried to pick the mule up at the main airport where one of them went to the arrivals holding up a sign with his name, but somehow missed him, and instead and so, back to the apartment they go to wait it out. The waiting game ends when some of the packages seem to have ruptured in the man's small intestine and he passes away, unfortunately, without delivering the goods. And so, the guy is now dead and the three geniuses decide to dump his body. They came up with the ingenious idea to drive to the hometown where one of them was raised away up north, a route that takes 8 hours in best conditions, where their plan was to weigh the body down and dump it in the harbor where he wouldn't be found again. They wrap the body up in a plastic tarp and a rug and stuff him into the truck of their Jeep. And while the local guy flies to his mom up north, his two friends start driving off in the dead of winter to find that safe place where they can dump the body. After they drive without paying attention to the weather warnings of severe Arctic snowstorms that are about to hit the country. As expected, a blizzard hits their travel route, so they're forced to seek shelter and overnight in a tiny town where the only accommodation was this tiny hotel that, by coincidence, is located next to the local police station. For 2 whole nights, too, their small Jeep is parked next to the local police vehicles with a dead body in the truck. The blizzards let up, so they venture on and finally reach the guy's hometown, where they get snowed in again, still with the body in the truck. The local guy shows them around this small town, and off they go next to the right harbor, where they manage to weigh the body down with the chains and bobbings, and the local guy stabs the body a few times so the intestinal gases don't make the body float up. On the pier, they have a heated discussion about whether to cut the body open to get the drugs out, the driver arguing for it with the locals strictly against it, refusing to do more of the dirty work. That dark night, they dump the poor man's body into the freezing ocean before spending 2 extra nights snowed in at the local's mom's house. She noted during the interrogation that she'd been so happy to get a surprise visit from him and his friends, and even happier when the weather kept them longer. Eventually, the snowstorm lets up, though, so they're able to drive back home, again being forced to have a night once on the way due to the bad weather conditions. The day after they leave town, a ship accidentally crashes into the pier in the town, so a driver has to go down to take a look. And lo and behold, he finds the body wrapped in chains and clear plastic. Somebody remembers that a gray Jeep had been standing on the pier a few nights before, and since it was a small town, it didn't take long for the cops to find out whose car it was and trace the owner. 3 men are arrested and are shown on the news, and you probably guessed it by now, but one of them being of manslaughter. I believe that they spent several years in jail and a while on probation too. This whole story is actually really famous in my country, and the police reports honestly read like pure fiction. It's a great example of truth being stranger than fiction, and also served as proof to me that I should always trust my senses.